In his masterpiece, The Count of Monte Cristo, Alexandre Dumas creates this thrilling drama of Edmond Dantes. Edmond Dantes is a French merchant sailor during the Napoleonic Wars. For Edmond, everything seemed to be going right in his life. At the age of 19 years old, his career is just about to take off. He becomes the captain of a merchant ship, a very lucrative career choice in that day and age. He's engaged to his beautiful fiancée, Mercedes, and life is looking really bright for him. It looks like it's all uphill from here. It's all going to be amazing. It's all going to be incredible until everything falls apart. He is falsely accused of treason, and he is brought before a magistrate who sentences him to life in prison without a trial. He has no idea what's going on. There is no witness. There are no appeals. His life just gets turned upside down in a single moment. And we, the reader, are left wondering, how did this happen? How did it all fall apart so quick? And we see through the story that it's through a series of compromises. It's through a series of compromises that his friends and his companions and people around him make. And the truth of the matter, friends, is we can all be tempted to make compromises. We can compromise what we know to be true if the benefit of the compromise is worth it. It's really tempting when it's worth it to compromise. We get into situations with such resolve to be strong, to be righteous, to be pure, to be godly, but we find ourselves weakening and then falling just the same. How do we get there? How do we get to that point where we fall? The main thing I want to talk about this morning from our text is the making of a compromise. How do we get to a place where we do something that we never wanted to do? How is it that we go from taking a stand for God and for his righteousness to doing something utterly unthinkable? How do we get to that point? Our text this morning is John chapter 18, the very end of it, verses 38 through chapter 19, verse 16. So go ahead and turn your Bibles while I catch us up to speed on the context. It's Friday morning, the day of Christ's crucifixion, when this scene unfolds. The Jewish leaders, the religious leaders, have dragged Jesus to Pilate first thing in the morning. They weren't allowed to have a trial in the night, so they brought him to Pilate first thing in the morning at dawn. And we find out in our text it's about noon now. So this has been a long process. It's been a long trial. And we're dropping back into our scene here of Jesus on trial before Pilate. Look with me at John 18, verse 38. After he had said this, that is when Pilate said, "What is truth?" he went back outside to the Jews and told them, "I find no guilt in him, but you have a custom that I should release one man for you at Passover. So do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews?" They cried out again, "Not this man, but Barabbas." Now Barabbas was a robber. Then Pilate took Jesus and flogged him. And the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and arrayed him in a purple robe. They came up to him saying, "Hail, the King of the Jews!" And they struck him with their hands. Pilate went out again and said to them, "See, I am bringing him out to you that you may know I find no guilt in him." So Jesus came out, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, "Behold the man." When the chief priests and officers saw him, they cried out, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate said to them, "Take him yourself and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him." The Jews answered him, "We have a law, and according to that law he ought to die because he has made himself the Son of God." When Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid. He entered his headquarters again and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. So Pilate said to him, "You will not speak to me? Do you not know that I have authority to release you and authority to crucify you?" Jesus answered him, "You would have no authority over me at all unless it had been given you from above. Therefore, he who delivered me over to you has the greater sin." From then on, Pilate sought to release him. But the Jews cried out, "If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar." So when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Stone Pavement, in Aramaic, Gabbatha. Now it was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about the 6th hour. He said to the Jews, "Behold, your king." They cried out, away with him, crucify him." Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." So he delivered him over to them to be crucified. The word of our Lord. I want to break this text up into 3 parts. The 3 phases of a compromise. 3 phases of a compromise. Phase number 1 of a compromise: you entertain compromise. You entertain it. Look at chapter 18, verse 38. Pilate said, or the text says, after he had said this, "What is truth?" he went back outside to the Jews and told them, "I find no guilt in him." That was the verdict that we talked about last week. As a result of the investigation, Pilate declares Jesus innocent. That's what he knew to be true. He knew that to be the truth, that this man is not guilty of insurrection. But look at verse 39. "I find no guilt in him, but you have a custom. You have a custom that I should release one man for you at Passover. So do you want me to release for you the King of the Jews?" The account of the story in the book of Matthew shows Pilate giving the options to the Jews. Do you want me to release for you Barabbas or Jesus? Which one do you want? That word "but" is critical. It's a critical moment when compromise becomes an option in Pilate's mind. When you know the right thing to do and you allow yourself to say, "But I know I shouldn't visit this website, but I know I should put my actual income on this form, but I know I shouldn't go to this guy's house or this girl's house, but..." When we know the right thing to do and we say, "but," we are opening the door to compromise. We are making compromise a viable option. We are putting it on the multiple choice test. Pilate knew Jesus was innocent. He knew it beyond a shadow of a doubt. He says it 3 times in his interactions with the Jewish leaders. If he were an uncompromising man, he would not have said that word "but." He would have walked out there with a backbone and said, "He's innocent, end of story, he's released. Jews, go home." If he had a backbone, if he was an uncompromising man, that's what he would have done. That was his conviction. That was the truth. But he introduces the option of compromise. He makes compromise available to himself. Now, why does he even entertain this? Why does he give the option to compromise? To understand why Pilate would introduce the option, you have to understand a little bit about his history. See, Pilate is on thin ice with Caesar. He's on thin ice with Caesar. He is trying to protect the crumbling political career that he has. It's not been going so well. He's earned his position through an ambitious military career when he fought in the Germanic wars with Rome as a legionnaire. And then to capstone his career, he married the granddaughter of the previous Caesar. That's what earned him his position as the governor of Israel. Unfortunately, there was a new Caesar. Unfortunately for Pilate, there was a new Caesar in town, Caesar Tiberius, who had a very lax approach to dealing with the Jews. He wanted the Jews to stop rebelling, to stop revolting, and so he took a very soft approach to the Jews. And Pilate took a long time to get with the new program. It was hard for him to adapt to that kind of policy. For instance, when Pilate first came to power, he rode into Jerusalem with flags carrying Caesar's image on it. To Jews, those were idols. That was idolatry. That was like blasphemy. They could not handle this new governor. He was a terrible, terrible idolater. And so they revolted. And so, okay, Pilate got a slap on the wrist from Caesar for that. Caesar's like, take the flags down, man. I know it's my image, but take it down. You're causing a revolt. The next thing he did is he tried to bring in some shields, and he didn't have the image of Caesar's face on it. He just had Caesar's name on it. And so he thought, this will be better. This will fly. The Jews revolted again. They wrote to Caesar and appealed, and Caesar said, Pilate, what are you doing, man? Get my name out of there. Just keep the peace, for goodness sake. It's not that hard. Pilate has another instance that we learn about in another gospel where he slaughtered some Galileans while they were making sacrifices to God, and he mixed their blood with the sacrifices. Another revolt. He is on very thin ice with Caesar. In fact, he's on such thin ice that there's one more instance, one more thing that happens where a bunch of Samaritans go out to the wilderness to have a religious ceremony with a false prophet. And Pilate goes and confronts them with soldiers and slaughters many of them. They appeal to Caesar one more time. Caesar says, that's it, you're done. He gets exiled to France and he commits suicide there. That's how Pilate's story ends. So you can understand why in this instance, when he is feeling the tension of the Jews rising, he's nervous, right? He's expecting that there might be another revolt. And he wants to appease them any way he can. If he has one more revolt, he knows that he's done. So he knows that Jesus is innocent. He wants to let him off, but he also wants to keep the Jews happy. He wants to have both things. Now, from our perspective, it seems insane that Pilate thinks that the religious leaders would actually pick Jesus over Barabbas, right? We know this side of history that they would never want that. He's not so sure. And after all, it's not crazy because he had Jesus brought to him under the accusation of an insurrectionist. And so he's thinking, okay, here's an innocent insurrectionist. I actually have a guilty insurrectionist in jail right now. That might work. Look at verse 40. They cried out again, not this man, but Barabbas. Now, Barabbas was a robber. You probably have a footnote in your Bible right after that word robber, and your footnote probably says insurrectionist. The Greek word behind that word, insurrectionist or robber, implies a political plunderer, a radical murderous zealot, a nationalist, an overthrower. So it's easy to see Pilate's thought process here. They dragged Jesus in here because they thought he was an insurrectionist. I found him innocent of insurrection, but I have an actual insurrectionist in jail. This is convenient, Pilate thinks. They will probably choose to release the innocent man. That's what he thinks. Clearly, Pilate misread the room. The religious leaders knew Jesus was no insurrectionist. They knew he was no threat to Rome. That was a lie. They worked up those charges. This was an easy choice for them. And so in a moment of incredible irony, they chose to release the actual insurrectionist and to try to condemn the innocent one. They chose to release a man who was an actual threat to Rome and to condemn the man who was no threat to Rome, but was a threat to them, to the religious leaders. It's really fascinating. If you read this account of Barabbas in one of the other Gospels, I just want you to put yourself in his shoes. After all, Barabbas' name means son of the Father. I think that's a literary way of saying this is like the son of every man. This is every person. We were all supposed to identify with Barabbas. In the other Gospels, if you think about it, Barabbas is probably in a jail cell somewhere around this trial, in this courthouse. And he probably can't hear Pilate's words, but he could probably hear the shouts of the crowd. And so from his perspective, the interaction goes something like this. Pilate says, "Who do you want me to release?" And the crowd yells, "Barabbas." So the first thing that he hears out of the crowd is his own name. So now he's paying attention. Barabbas, my name has been mentioned. People are talking about me out there in the courtyard. What are they going to say? And then Pilate, whom he doesn't hear, says something like this: "But I find him innocent. Or I find Jesus innocent. What should I do with Jesus? The crowd yells, crucify him. You see the dilemma. You see what Pilate is hearing. He hears his name, and he hears crucify him. And you can imagine, just put yourself in his shoes, you can imagine the feeling when he hears the lock click on his jail cell. And then the latch of the door opens, and there's 2 Roman guards there, and they grab him, and they pull him out of his cell, and they take him out to the crowd. And he thinks he's done. He thinks, I am guilty. They want me crucified, and I deserve this. And then what happens? The guards unchain him and drop the chains to the floor. And they say, you're free to go. And as he's walking away, he probably hears Pilate say of Jesus, this man, but I find no guilt in him. And he hears the crowds say, crucify him. And it all clicks for him. He understands what's going on. This man is taking my place, though he is innocent. We're all supposed to identify with that. This man went to the cross, though he was innocent, for us who are not innocent, who are guilty. Barabbas is like us. He is the son, he is the daughter of every man. So that's phase number 1 of compromise. You entertain it. You give it an option. You know the right thing to do, but you make compromise an option. Let's go to phase number 2. Phase number 2 of a compromise. Go against what you know to be true. Deny what you know to be true. You know the right thing to do, and you deny it. Look at chapter 19, verse 1. Then Pilate took Jesus and flogged him. Pilate is still trying to have his cake and eat it too, right? He's still trying to figure out how to get out of this situation, how to keep the Jews happy and let Jesus off. He wants to appease his conscience and appease the Jews. He wants to do 2 things. He still thinks he can get both. This is how you compromise. When you think you can do the right thing and still do the thing that your flesh desires, and so you're frantically trying to get both things. Pilate thinks, if my soldiers beat Jesus within an inch of his life, then maybe the Jews will be satisfied with the punishment. So Pilate orders him to be scourged, and a scourging is no small thing. We've never seen a scourging. This was a common thing back then. They had whips that would sink deep into the flesh and the muscle of somebody's back, and then they would rip. The Jews had a law that you couldn't do this more than 39 times because it could probably kill the person. The Romans had no such law, and the guards get carried away. Look at verse 2. And the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and arrayed him with a purple robe. And they came up to him saying, "Hail the King of the Jews," and they struck him with their hands. The other Gospels tell us that they gave him a rod as a pretend royal scepter, and they would take it out of his hand and smack him on the head with it and drive the thorns across his scalp. This is all fulfilling prophecy. We sometimes wonder, is Jesus in control? He was in control of his arrest. He was in control at his trial. He is in control of his scourging. Acts chapter 2 tells us that Jesus was delivered up by the definite plan and the foreknowledge of God. We learn in John chapter 3 that Jesus, the Son of Man, must be lifted up like that bronze serpent. The crucifixion was the plan. It wasn't going to be a stoning. It wasn't going to be being thrown off a cliff. It was going to be a crucifixion. He had to be lifted up. He had to be cursed by God by hanging on a tree from Isaiah. The crown of thorns was a picture of the thorns that came as a result of the curse when man fell in Genesis chapter 3. Here, Jesus is bearing that curse on his own head. He's beaten with his own mock scepter. He's beaten beyond the point of human recognition, Isaiah chapter 52, so that he was despised. He could count his bones. They were probably exposed on his back. Psalm 22, verse 17. All of this was happening according to plan. He was in control the whole time. And yet, these people are not innocent. They're choosing to do this. They're choosing to compromise. You see in all of this brutality, all of this shameful beating of the Creator by his creatures, that he is willing. No one is taking his life from him. He is not a mere victim here. He is innocent, but in control. And he bears those scars for eternity. He bears those scars right now at the right hand of the Father. In another twist of irony, here Jesus is arrayed as a king. He's arrayed as a bloody, barely recognizable king, but yet a supremely noble and dignified king. To the Romans, they present Jesus as a king as a mockery to the Jews. And the Jews see this as an embarrassment to themselves. The Romans are like, look, here's your king. Look how awful he is. And the Jews are like, that's not our king. That's embarrassing. Don't say that. To Christians, this is our king. This is a sacrificial lamb. This is who is bold as a lion. A king who loves us to the point of death. A king who will bear the wrath of God on himself on behalf of his people. What looks like a joke to the Romans and an insult to the Jews, to us looks like the wisdom and the power of God. This is the visual depiction of what Paul will write decades later. Christ crucified is a stumbling block to the Jews and folly to the Gentiles. But to those of us who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ is the power and the wisdom of God. Even standing there bloodied, he is the power of God. That's salvation standing there. That's rescue standing there. Church, you know when you refuse to compromise, when you identify as a Christian, isn't this how the world sees you too? Either a joke or an offense. When we're standing faithful with Christ, that's how they view us. That's how we can identify with his sufferings, when we are willing to be considered a joke or an embarrassment for Christ. That's how they will look at us. That's how they will perceive us if we are being faithful. After Pilate has tortured Jesus, look what he says in verses 4 and 5. Pilate went out again and said to them, "See, I am bringing him out to you that you may know that I find no guilt in him." So Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, "Behold, the man." He's like, look, guys, I've beaten him for you. I've beaten him within an inch of his life. He's innocent, but aren't you satisfied with this bleeding, almost dead prisoner? Pilate's compromise has devolved from giving compromise an option to beating an innocent man nearly to death. Pilate is hoping that the Jewish leaders will be content with this beating, that they'll see how violently the Romans have tortured Christ, and then they'll say, okay, that's enough, that's enough. We know he's innocent. That's fine. That's what he's hoping. But look at verse 6. When the chief priests and officers saw him, they cried out, "Crucify him, crucify him." Pilate has clearly underestimated their resolve, their hatred for him. I think that Pilate is exasperated and frustrated here. He's almost mocking the religious leaders. He says, you want him dead so badly? Crucify him yourself. And he knows, and they know, they can't do that. If they crucify Jesus, they are violating the law of the Romans, and he would have to impose the death penalty on them. But the plot thickens in verse 7. The Jews answered him, "We have a law, and according to that law, he ought to die because he made himself the Son of God." Okay. Now the truth comes out. They brought Jesus here claiming he was an insurrectionist. That was proven to be false again and again. They persisted with that argument, but Pilate was refusing to bend on condemning Jesus as an insurrectionist. So the religious leaders have to change their strategy. They finally show their hand to Pilate. They finally reveal the real reason they have brought Jesus. It's not because he was a threat to Rome. Pilate saw right through that. It's because he was a threat to them. He was a threat to their kingdom. It's because he claimed to be God. They said that he violated Leviticus 24. Whoever blasphemes the Lord shall be put to death. They claimed that he committed blasphemy by claiming to be God. And if he was God, that means that all of his criticisms of them were true and valid. It means that their hypocrisy is real. It means that their self-righteousness is wickedness. It means that they are whitewashed tombs, perfect on the outside, but dead to God on the inside. It means that they are guilty of putrid, dead religion, and they couldn't bear the thought of any of that being true. So rather than repenting of the accusations, they sought to kill their God and to silence the accusations. They are like Fernand in the Count of Monte Cristo. Fernand was Edmund's friend prior to his unjust sentencing. After Edmund was imprisoned, Fernand, his friend, supposed friend, swoops in and marries his fiancée. Edmund figures out while he's in prison that it was Fernand who accused him of treason, and he did it out of envy for his fiancée. We learn in Matthew that Pilate knows why the Jews have brought him there. He knows that it's out of envy for Jesus that the Jewish religious leaders have brought him. So it's all coming into focus for Pilate. He's not there because of insurrection. He's there because the powerful Jews hate him. He is actually holy, and they're just pretending to be. He has multitudes listening to him, and they don't. He speaks with authority that they could only dream of possessing. He can do miracles, and they can't. They envy him. From Pilate's point of view, he sees that envy. But now he hears that Jesus is some kind of God. He's the son of a God. That's how he would have heard it as a Roman. He's a God. And verse 8 tells us, when Pilate finally understood this, he was even more afraid. Afraid of what? What would Pilate have to fear? He's in charge, he thinks. I think he's probably afraid that the Jews aren't going to drop this. He's not going to be able to have his cake and eat it too. But I think he's also afraid of Jesus. After all, the Romans had categories for gods having children or visiting humans. That's why we see in the book of Acts when Paul and Barnabas are in Lystra and they heal somebody, they call the Lystrans, they call Paul Hermes and Barnabas Zeus. They think the gods have visited us. There's probably something similar going on with Pilate, seeing Jesus, hearing about his miracles. Add to that, his wife has a dream about Jesus saying, don't have anything to do with this righteous man. For Pilate, he's probably thinking, this might be a god. This might be a god, and he's even more afraid. This has never been about insurrection, he realizes. They would have taken their Barabbas bait if it was. He's been trying to figure out what the Jews were up to. He knows they hate him. He knows they hate Rome. They hate Pilate. They hate Caesar. Why does it seem like they hate Jesus so much more, though? Jesus wasn't a threat to Rome, but he was a threat to their dead religion. But this causes him to be more afraid because he could be a god. And if he's a Roman god, he's a capricious god. The Roman gods were not gracious. So he possibly has a Roman god in the flesh on trial before him, and he's just scourged him. He's afraid. Look what happens next in verse 9. He entered his headquarters again and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" I think half expecting him to say, "Mount Olympus." But Jesus gave him no answer. Or as Isaiah predicted 800 years before, he was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep before his shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. He's always in complete control. Then Pilate gets angry in verse 10. "You will not speak to me? Do you know I have the authority to release you and the authority to crucify you?" He says, "You have no authority over me unless it's given to you from above." Jesus is saying again, "No one will take my life from me. I will lay it down of my own accord. You will be the one to give the sentence, but I go and sacrifice myself for my beloved. And so finally, we get to the second phase of the compromise. Jesus says in verse 11, therefore, he who delivered me over to you has the greater sin. Did you hear those two words? Greater sin. We're so used to saying, well, all sin is equal before God. But Jesus himself says there is greater sin. There is greater sin. It exists. It can be committed. Who is Jesus talking about? He who delivered me over to you has the greater sin. He's talking about the people who should know better. Judas, Annas, Caiaphas, the high priests, the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the people who had the good theology, the people who were in synagogue every Saturday their whole lives, the people who should know better, the people who know the truth. They commit the greater sin than Pilate. See, Jesus knew that Pilate didn't know the Old Testament. Pilate never went to synagogue. Pilate was not a monotheist. He didn't know Yahweh. He would be guilty of condemning Jesus, of compromising by trying to appease the Jews. But that is not nearly as great of a sin as those who know better, who know the truth. The greater sin is not homosexuality. The greater sin is not fornication or adultery. The greater sin is not murder or racism. The greater sin is having knowledge of the truth and then rejecting it. That's the greatest sin. Rejecting greater light, rejecting greater revelation, rejecting truth is the greater sin that will lead to greater judgment. Caiaphas, Judas, Annas, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, they will all have greater judgment because they had a thorough knowledge of God, a solid theology, and yet they rejected it. Pilate knew almost nothing. The greater sin is not any specific sin. The greater sin is to know the truth and to spit in his face. Friends, this should be very scary for us, for everyone sitting here, because if you're here in West Hills, you know the truth. You know the truth. You hear it every Sunday. It would be better for you to never have come to church. It will be more bearable on Judgment Day to know as little as possible of the truth than for you to know it and reject it. Christ has spoken to you. You have heard the truth. You must now respond. And so if you're thinking, I'll respond in a couple of years. I'll get my act together first, then I'll respond. I'll have some fun first when I move out of my parents' house, and then I'll respond. Then I will listen to the truth, but not now. There's too much fun runway ahead of me first. I'll respond later. You are in grave danger if that is your approach to the truth. You may not hear his voice 2 years from now, 1 year from now, 1 week from now. He may stop speaking. He may be silent, as he was before Pilate. Jesus is warning religious people like you and like me. Phase 2 of a compromise, deny what you know to be true. When you have something that you desire as much or more than Jesus, you will entertain a compromise. Then when you know the truth, you know the right thing to do, but doing this other thing seems easier or more pleasurable or more profitable or more fulfilling, you will deny it. You know deep down to your core that the truth is that Jesus will bring you greater joy, greater freedom, greater riches, greater satisfaction, but you deny that truth and you believe the lie. Actually, this sin will be better than Jesus. And you look truth in the face and you believe the lie. That's the second phase of compromise. Deny what you know to be true. Let's look much more quickly at the third phase. Convince yourself of the lie. Convince yourself of the lie. Look at verse 12. From then on, Pilate sought to release him. But the Jews cried out, "If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone makes himself a king, opposes Caesar." So Pilate almost seems ready to have a backbone. He almost seems ready to release Jesus, and then the Jews drop this bomb. He's tried giving them a choice between Barabbas and Judas. That backfired. He's already tried beating Jesus nearly to death. That accomplished nothing. And now he's finally ready to just do the hard thing and release Jesus and see what happens. But then they blackmail him. They say, if you release him, Caesar is going to hear about it. There's going to be a revolt. Another one. Your choice, Pilate. Do you want Caesar to hear about this? That you're not a friend of him? Jesus and Pilate have been playing chess over Jesus' life, and they have just moved to checkmate. Pilate has been trying to figure out what the Jews want. It's not the release of an insurrectionist. It's not a tortured blasphemer. He realized that the only outcome that will satisfy them is Jesus being silenced once and for all. They have played him masterfully. And Pilate knows that he's just been beat. Look at verses 13 through 15. So when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at the place called the Stone Pavement. He's ready to give his judgment, his sentence. Now it was the day of preparation of the Passover, right as the lambs were being prepared to be sacrificed. It was about the 6th hour. This is a long trial and a long beating. And he said to the Jews, "Behold, your king." They cried out, away with him, crucify him." Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" One last-ditch effort. The chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." Are you kidding me? No king but Caesar? These are religious Jews. What hypocrites, what liars. What about the Jewish passage from the Old Testament, Isaiah 33:22? For the Lord is our judge, for the Lord is our lawgiver, for the Lord is our king. Yahweh was their king. They are lying through their teeth. They are convincing themselves that they are right. They are convincing themselves that they don't have a king except Caesar. Phase number 3 for a compromise. Allow anyone or anything other than Jesus to be your king. If it's your spouse, your girlfriend, your boyfriend, your children, your career, your wealth, your health, physical pleasure, whatever it is that reigns as sovereign over your life, you will compromise for that person or that thing every time. For Pilate, it was his position. It was his career. It was his wealth. It was his political power. It was his friendship with Caesar. What is it for you? What amount of money? What amount of affection from that person? What amount of pleasure? What amount of praise? What amount of fame? What amount of success? What would it take for something to dethrone Jesus as king in your life? You can only have one king, one thing or person that you love the most, one master that you will serve. Look at the last verse in our text. How does it end? In verse 16. So, he delivered him over to be crucified. The compromise has reached its final form. And then he goes out in your place and dies on the cross for compromisers, for sinners, for people who worship other things, other people. When we are weak, he dies for us. In the Count of Monte Cristo, Edmund escapes his prison after 20 years. 20 years of being held there. He's lost his youth in this cell. And he sets out to implement this intricate plan for revenge against those people who have falsely accused him and falsely delivered him over. But in the end, Edmund is faced with a choice. He has two loves. He has two choices. He can choose his fiancée or he can choose revenge. He can't have both. To choose his fiancée would mean that he cannot have his precious justice, his glorious revenge is over. To choose revenge would mean that he loses his fiancée. Like all of us, Edmund wants both, but he realizes that you can never have two competing masters. He has to choose between what he knows is right, love and forgiveness, instead of what will feel the best, revenge and justice. He chooses forgiveness. Brothers and sisters, let the love of Christ, let that image of our beaten and crucified Savior be the controlling master of your life. Whenever you're tempted to compromise, behold your King. Look at your King. That bloody, mangled, crowned with thorns King who doesn't defend himself, but willingly goes to the cross for you. Cultivate a love for that man, and you will be strong in the face of compromise.